So how then do we establish direction in the small church? To understand that question and to really answer that question, we need to look at how does the small church approach goals and direction? Because that's part of administration. And yet the small church has a different perspective of goals than the large church does. The small church tends to be focused more upon the direction and purpose of a church rather than goals. Now, when we think about the difference between a goal and a purpose, what is that difference? Well, when we think about a purpose defines the reason why we exist and why we do what we do. Goals define what we desire to accomplish. The purpose focuses upon maintenance functions. That is, we talk about what is the purpose we're dealing with, what is the purpose of the church, what is it that sustains the church and guides the church over the long haul. Goals, however, focus upon more of a managerial function. Goals are that which measure growth in a sense of accomplishment. And as we look at that, the small church focuses more upon the purpose, why we exist. That's their concern, versus answering the question, what are we to do? What are we to accomplish? Now that has both pluses and negatives. The plus of that, it keeps the small church focused on what is important. The negative side of that is oftentimes the church can become lackadaisical about accomplishing things or making changes to be more effective. But we need to understand that. And also that the purpose of the small church is different. While they share the same biblical purpose, that is that they have a commitment to advance the kingdom of Christ, they have a commitment to build in the lives of people, it's a different approach. It's a different perspective. In the small church, the focus of the purpose of the church is to build relationships. In the large church, it's to build the kingdom. Now, as we think about this relational building, it's not just we want to develop a social club that people can come to and interact with one another on a social basis. But rather, it's a relational-based focus of purpose, that the purpose of the church is to assist and build in people a relationship, both, first of all, with God, that they desire to have that relational connection with God, so that it's a personal relationship. And so the church views its ministry from the standpoint of how is it building in the lives of people a closer relationship with God. And then a closer relationship to one another, and how it can build that. Whereas in the large church, oftentimes the focus is more upon accomplishing results. That is, building the kingdom, reaching greater numbers, setting goals. Now again, this is not to say that the small church is better or has a more biblical focus than the large church, because both of them have a biblical basis for them. And in fact, the small church needs to look at how it can build the kingdom, just as the large church needs to look at how can it build better relationships and more intact relationships in the church. But it affects its approach to goals. Carl Dudley makes this statement in his book, Making the Small Church Effective. He says, technically they, that is the small church, can be said to be goalless, but that should never be confused with the absence of determined purposefulness. To confuse the absence with goals with the absence of purpose is like suggesting that those who do not speak English do not know how to talk. And he's right in that assessment, that the small church is not so much concerned about goals as it is about the purpose of building relationships both with God and with one another. And so that becomes the focal point on how they can accomplish that. The second thing we need to recognize is that the small church is oftentimes reluctant to set goals because of its culture. we need to recognize that goals will only be as effective in the small church as people are willing to accept them. If people are not going to back the goal, if they don't accept the goal, we can write it down, we can communicate it all we want, we can sell the vision, if you would, but if they don't buy into it, it will never be accomplished. Because ultimately they will vote not in a congregational meeting, but they will vote with their time and with their resources. And if they are not in agreement with the goals, if they're not backing the goals, they will not commit their time, nor will they commit their resources. And so we need to look at, why is it in the small church they're reluctant to set goals? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, people are reluctant to set goals that may be because they see them as divisive in the church. Now again, as we think about the small church, it functions as a family and it functions as a unit. And so, as we've talked about, decisions are based upon how it affects relationships. Well, when it comes to goals, oftentimes they see it as a choice between possible goals. And so here is the Christian Ed Committee coming to the board, and they have some goals that they want to accomplish in ministry, and that require resources and that require some financial commitments of the church. And here's another ministry over here, let's say the worship ministry, that they too have some goals that are going to require some financial commitments. But as a result, then these two goals come in competition. And as a result, people start struggling over which would be the right goal. And so when conflicts and tension begin to arise about which goal is the correct goal and which should be the focal point of the church, the people see that as divisive within the church and causing problems. So they're reluctant then to set goals. Secondly, people in the small church are reluctant to set goals because of their aversion to organizational bureaucracy. One of the reasons people are attracted to the small church is because of its simplicity organizationally. Especially in suburban areas, there are individuals who they go to work and there's a lot of organizational bureaucracy in their company, and they just get tired of the red tape. They get tired of all the politics that go on in a large corporation, and so they come to the small church because they enjoy the simplicity of it. They enjoy the fact that there's not a lot of pressure of goals that they have to face, and see those goals as a way to try to manage people and to control their actions. And so they come to the small church and they don't want that. As a result, they're reluctant to set goals because they see it as part of the bureaucracy that controls their life. A third reason they're reluctant to set goals is because they oftentimes don't see the value or need for them. Especially in rural areas, churches are reluctant to set goals because they don't think in terms of goals and objectives. For example, farmers and ranchers by nature are not goal setters. They don't sit down at the start of the year and say, our goal here is to get the crops in by the 1st of June and to expand the farm by 25% in terms of its acreage. They don't think in those terms, in those quantitative terms. Rather, they sit down and their goal is to get the crop in as soon as possible, because the dry months of July, if the crops aren't in soon, will cause the plants to wither. They won't get grounded and established early enough before the dry spell, and it affects the yield of the crop. But it's not a goal orientation, but rather it's a holistic orientation. And so when they come to church, their focus also is not upon goals, but upon what needs to be done in the present. Their goal is not to expand the church facilities. The goal is to take care of what the church needs are at the moment, because that's part of their culture. And then lastly, and related to this, people are reluctant to set goals because it's outside the realm of their culture. Again, especially in rural areas, there's a present orientation rather than a future orientation. Within the culture of the rural community, it's very much of a now focus. What are the needs now? What's going on now? They don't think about the future, and part again is that of the nature of rural life. When a farmer sits down and outlines his day, he recognizes that his day is going to be radically different than what he thinks it will. He may sit down and say, okay, my plan for today is to plant the 45 acres over in this area of the farm, but as soon as he gets out in the field, he gets a call that the cattle are out, and he's got to stop, and he's got to go fix the fence, and he's got to put the cattle in, and he's got to repair the fence. And so his day goes radically different than his goals. And so they don't think of those terms. They think of what is the needs now, what's happening now at the moment, because that's where their life functions. Also, as when we looked at culture, rural people tend to be event-oriented. That leads to a let come what may outlook that is not tied to any precise schedule. Whereas a time-oriented people are focused more upon tight schedules, are more goal-oriented. So there's a cultural reason why the small church does not think in terms of goals. Now, does that mean that the small church shouldn't set goals, that we should just look at planning as something that only a large church is required to do? I don't believe so. I believe that the small church does need to set goals at times. It does need to do effective planning and strategic planning. But when are we to set goals? Well, I think there's several occasions specifically when we need to sit down and establish goals for the church. And the first is when the church is faced with a crisis. Oftentimes, we face a financial crisis. And a financial crisis requires that cuts be made and that we start developing a different strategy that needs to be implemented, because if we continue on the present course, we're going to come into financial problems. Or perhaps we're under an attendance crisis, when the church has declined to a point where it is struggling to staff basic ministries. And so it's during these crisis points that we need to maybe sit back and do some strategic planning and set some goals that will enable us to get out of the crisis. Because as we clarify goals, it enables us to prioritize how we will utilize our resources. When resources become tight, it's important then that we prioritize and say, okay, where do we need to focus our resources at this given point, whether it's financial, whether it's the resources of volunteer time. Where do we need to focus? Where do we need to prioritize to get us out of the crisis and to get us on a firm foundation again? And so setting goals and developing a strategic plan enables us to do that. Secondly, in terms of a crisis, clarifying goals enables the church to establish a strategy to move out of the crisis. See, a crisis is a position the church finds itself in that if it continues, it will threaten the very existence of the church. And so when we're in that kind of a crisis, when the existence of the church is threatened, we need to establish goals and a direction so it'll enable us to get out of that crisis, so that we can move from the edge of viability back to a point of spiritual and organizational health. And goals can enable us to do that. And then thirdly, when we're in a crisis, clarifying goals can strengthen the morale of a congregation. Because when we're in a crisis, especially in the small church, when it's financial or when it's an attendance crisis, people get discouraged and they begin to wonder, is there any hope for the future of the church? They begin to wonder if the church is going to close its doors, and so they become discouraged. And when we sit back and start developing a strategy, it helps to build a future orientation in the church. It helps to strengthen the morale as people become excited and they begin to realize that the church has a future, that there is direction that we are going, that we are making positive steps. And sometimes those can be as simple as just repainting the sanctuary, or maybe repainting the church, or upgrading the facilities of the church, so that the church begins to see that it has a future potential in ministry. And so clarifying goals can enable us to do that. So that's the first time we want to set goals, that it may be necessary to think through some goals, is when our church is in crisis. Secondly, we need to set goals when the church is faced with new ministry opportunities. When the church is faced with new ministry opportunities, it can no longer continue doing things the way they've always been done. Simply because if they do so, it would prevent the church from ministering in this new opportunity. And so the church, as we think about new potentials or new opportunities, we need to set goals in relationship to that. So that new ministries require new strategies. And that calls strategic planning, where we sit down and identify goals and direction and strategies of how we're going to more effectively minister. Thirdly, the small church needs to set goals when it's faced with a need for change. Certainly the small church operates in the present. It operates in the here and now. It functions on an ongoing basis based upon, okay, what are the needs at the present and how can we meet those needs? But there are times when that will no longer enable the church to be effective in ministry. When that focus will become a hindrance to the purpose of the church. When it actually starts to cause the church to become ingrown, so it's no longer accomplishing its biblical purpose. And as a result, change is required so that we can start being effectively and doing what God called us to do, as revealed in His Word. And that requires us to develop some goals, some strategies. For example, the church is no longer being effective in reaching its community. Back 40, 50 years ago, if you wanted to have an evangelistic event, you would bring in a special singer or some kind of a musical group that would bring an evangelistic message, and the people would come from the community because it was a social event. It was an event that people could come and socialize, and so it was part of the community activities. But now with the myriad of community activities that we have today, it's no longer effective. And so the church needs to think of something new, that having a musical group come in with an evangelistic message will only get the faithful church attenders out. And so how is the church now going to reach this new generation with the gospel of Christ? How can it impact its community in the new ministry environment? And so the church needs to change. Or perhaps the church has grown beyond the limits of its physical size. So goals need to be established that would expand the facilities of the church. So certainly when the church is faced with the need for change, then is a time to sit back, do some strategic planning, set some goals in terms of how we can effectively implement the changes that are needed. And then fourth, it's beneficial to set goals when the church is not reaching its potential. When the church is not measuring up to its potential ministry. So that the church has become bogged down in past methods and focuses upon what it can sustain itself rather than what can be effective in reaching its community. And as a result, it needs to change because the potential is there for ministry, but it's just not meeting that potential. As time passes, there is certainly a need for constant reevaluation of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because otherwise we can easily become into the flow of ministry where we're just maintaining the status quo. And while that can oftentimes be sufficient, there are times when the status quo is no longer cutting it, when it's no longer enabling the church to reach its maximum potential. And as a result, it needs to make changes. and so it needs new goals. Or perhaps the church is faced with an expansion of its potential, so that the ministry opportunities are expanding. For example, this might be a sudden influx of new people into the community. And so all of a sudden there's new potential for outreach, because there's new people who are coming in who are unfamiliar with the church and perhaps have been untouched by the gospel message. And so there's a new opportunity. Perhaps it's an influx of for example, of Hispanics into the community because of a change in the job situation. And so there's a new potential for ministry. Or perhaps it's new people who come to the church. And because they have arrived in church, they bring a new opportunities of ministry because of their spiritual gifts. For example, let's say that a new person comes in who has a real gift for working with teens, and the church has never had a youth ministry because they've never really had anybody that can relate well to teens. And now all of a sudden this new person comes in and they're like a magnet to teens, and they can be effective in reaching teens, and all of a sudden the church has the potential of establishing a strong teen ministry. And so because of that new potential ministry, it's important that the church then strategize in terms of how it can be more effective in implementing that new ministry. So then how then do we start building a strategic plan? How do we start implementing that within the small church? Well, there's several things we need to understand in terms of the foundation of that ministry, in terms of how we can effectively plan. First of all, content must always be relative to context. Our planning must not be done in isolation of our context of our church and our community, but must be done within the context of that. And that begins with understanding our church. What is the context of our church? What is the gifts that people have? Every church has a different gift mix, if you would. A church of 50 has people that are gifted spiritually and strong in their giftedness in ministry, in particular areas of ministry. And so what is that? What is the strengths of the church? What is the gift mix, if you would? What are the talents of people within the church? What are they good at? Do they work well with their hands, or are they more planners? Or what are their abilities? What are their strengths? What are their talents? What are the resources of the church that it has at its disposal? What are the facilities that it has as its resources? What are the financial resources? What are the volunteer resources that people can bring? And so what are those within the context of the church? What is the level of spiritual maturity of the congregation? Oftentimes we don't look at that in strategic planning, but we need to, because if they're not mature spiritually, they're not going to be able to step out in faith. The more mature they are, the more they're going to be able to step out in faith and trust God to provide. And so what is that spiritual maturity? How much faith can they express by stepping out? So we need to think through, what is the context of the congregation? And how will that affect how we do ministry? And then secondly, what is the context of the community of the church? What is the geographic and social boundaries of our community? Every church has a boundary of ministry, every community. In other words, as we think about the church, there's a limit to how many they're going to reach. So what is the community's geographic and social boundaries? And how will that affect how we do ministry? Who are the people in the community? What are they like? How do they live? What are their habits? What is their culture? What is their hobbies? Who are they out there? And then lastly, what are the needs of people in the community? We may live in a very affluent community, and there's no need for an outreach program to the poor and social assistance to the poor. So it would be foolish of the church to develop a huge ministry of ministering to the poor and a food bank for the poor when there's none out there. So we need to think through, what are the needs of the people in the community and how can we effectively minister to them? We need to recognize the context of the church and then the context of the community. So content must be relative. The content of our goals must be relative to the context of our ministry. Secondly, the program or ministry must address real needs. Because the small church focuses upon people rather than organizations, we need to encourage people and communicate to people what are the needs. That the ministry is ministering to the needs of people. It's not just an organizational structure, it's not just a ministry plan, but it's a ministry to people. And they need to be able to see that relationship of how it's ministering to real people with real needs. Thirdly, as we think about setting goals, we need to seek input from a wide cross-section of the church and the community. Now, oftentimes when we think about goals, the first place we start, and rightly so, but the first place we start is a congregation. And we want to get people's feedback and people's ideas about where should the church be going. But it's also beneficial to go out in the community and get input from people in the community as we think about ministry. What are their perceived needs so that we can effectively minister to them? Because as we look at the needs in the community, the needs become a bridge by which we can share the gospel. Christ did this in his own ministry. That as he looked at needs, he saw the needs of people, the physical needs for healing, and he used that as a bridge or an opportunity to share the gospel. Sometimes they responded to the gospel, sometimes they didn't. For example, he came in contact with 10 lepers. And they asked to be healed, and he healed all 10. But how many responded to the gospel message of God's grace? Only one came back and responded. But Christ recognized that that was an opportunity to minister to needs and share the gospel. And then as we develop the goals and ministry of the church, be on the lookout for ideas that easily translate or adapt from one small church context to another. Now, it's important that we recognize that rarely will one idea cross over to another church. Some adaptation needs to be made for any idea. So as we look at ideas and we look at what worked effectively in other congregations, we need to ask ourselves, can that work here? And how can we adapt it to our ministry? So we can look at ideas from other churches. Then we need to be realistic in our goals and in our direction of the church. As a church, we must have what I call a grounded faith. That is, it's grounded, it's based upon wisdom, it's based upon an assessment of what we have and what we can do, but it's also based upon faith that enables us to reach out beyond what we believe we can accomplish. But it's a grounded faith. It's not unrealistic. And there's a balance between the two. In setting goals, we need to be creative. We need to not be afraid to think outside the box, to take risks. Oftentimes in the small church, we get locked into how we do things in a traditional way. And there's value in tradition, and there's value in doing things on a traditional way. But how can we think outside the box in terms of our ministry? As we look at our church and we look at our community, what are some new ideas that we can have? What are some creative ideas that we can have? And then we need to balance output or outward ministry and inward ministry. We need to have a balance in our ministry between that which ministers and builds up the congregation and that which reaches out into the community. Now, oftentimes, if there's the weakness in the small church, it's in the area of outward ministry. We become very proficient at taking care of our own. But oftentimes we don't have an outward focus of ministry. So as we think through the strategies and plans of the church, we need to ask ourselves, is there a balance between inward ministry and outward ministry? And how can we achieve that balance? We need to prioritize programs and resources. How can we maximize what we have for the glory of God? Where do we need to prioritize our ministries? What are the most important programs that we have in the church that enable us to be effective in accomplishing our purpose? Where do we need to channel our resources and prioritize those resources? And then we need to plan to evaluate and review. As we start thinking about strategic planning, we start thinking about developing a plan for the church, the goals for the church, we need to evaluate and review what we're doing. We need to take a step back and ask, did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? And if so, what do we need to do to improve it? And if not, why didn't it? And how can we achieve our purpose maybe by doing something different or tweaking what we're trying to do? So we do need to review it. So as we build upon this foundation, then we need to develop a strategic plan. Now, what is a strategic plan? As we think about developing a strategic plan for the church, there's several things about this plan. First of all, a strategic plan should answer three questions. First of all, it should answer the question, why does the church exist? In other words, a strategic plan identifies the purpose of the church. Why are we here? Why did God place us here? That should become foundational to everything that we do in our planning, in our goal setting, in the direction of the church. Secondly, a strategic plan should answer the question, what does God specifically want to accomplish in this church? What is God's will for this church? What is it that He's called us to do? So we identify the priority of the church, which answers that question. That becomes the priority of our ministry. So we prayerfully seek God's direction and ask Him to reveal to us what is it that He wants us to accomplish. And again, that goes back to examining our context, examining our gifts, examining our abilities as a church, our resources, all of that, part of which we develop in a sense of what is God's will and purpose for our church. And then lastly, as we think about strategic planning, we need to answer the question, how will we accomplish God's will? How will we accomplish His purpose, His will for our church? See, that's the identification of the methods that we will use. So that we begin to identify what is it we need to do to accomplish the task. So as we think about strategic planning, that's where it begins. We need to identify what is our purpose. We need to prayerfully seek God's direction and His will for the church based upon our context. And then we need to ask ourselves, okay, based upon that, how are we going to accomplish it? And that's where goals and strategic planning come in, because it's answering those questions. And as we do that, first of all, it will unite the church around a common purpose. It should bring clarity to our ministry, so that the church, rather than being divided, will become more united in its ministry. Because when we have unclear purposes, then we're going to have conflicts. Why? Because people become in competition over the resources that are available. And as a result, becomes unsettling for people. As we develop that strategic plan, it provides direction in prioritizing how we're going to utilize our resources. Oftentimes when the church, when we approach in the small church planning, we often think, well, that's something the big church does. We don't need to do that here. But But the reality is, the more limited our resources, the more purposeful we need to be in how we utilize those resources. If I were to give you $1 million and tell you to go to town shopping, you wouldn't have to give a lot of thought to what you would buy. You wouldn't have to do a lot of prioritizing of what you'd buy. You might want to go out and buy a new car, and then go and buy some food. And then you might want to buy a stereo or whatever it might be, because you have enough money that would enable you to buy anything that you really wanted. But if you only had $10 in your pocket and you were to go to town and do shopping, you would have to be a lot more focused in prioritizing what you're going to buy. You wouldn't want to go spend your money foolishly, because if you spend $10 buying a new shirt, you're not going to have that $10 to buy the food you need to eat. And so you need to prioritize more clearly, and that's true in the small church. That because we face limited resources, we need to be even more careful and think more clearly of where we're going to prioritize those resources. What is it that we need to be focused upon in the church? As we think about the advantage of strategic planning, it provides a forward view of ministry. Instead of looking at the past or becoming discouraged in the present, it enables us to continue looking forward in ministry for the potential and opportunities that God has given before us. The small church is it's easy in the small church to become focused upon the past. Remember the glory years when we used to have a real dynamic Sunday school. And so we start living in the past accomplishments of the church. We start living in the past of what was happening in the church 20, 30 years ago, instead of looking forward to what God can call us to do and what we can accomplish in the future. And so by sitting down and developing some planning, it enables us to start viewing things in a future orientation. It also prevents the church from becoming ingrown in ministry. As we've already mentioned, perhaps one of the weaknesses of the small church is that it can become so ingrown that it no longer has an outward focus of ministry. And by strategic planning, we're looking at that and saying, how can we be more effective in reaching our community? And then lastly, it assists in developing present and future leaders. By taking them through the process of developing a ministry plan, it provides training to help them make plans even for their own specific life in ministry. And that develops the leadership base of the church. So as we think about the process then of developing a strategic plan, the first thing we do in this process is that we need to clarify the purpose of the church. What is the purpose of the church? What is it the church is to accomplish? Why do we exist? Well, I believe that Paul gives us the answer to that question in Colossians chapter 1. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul makes this statement. He says in verse 28, "We proclaim him, admonishing and teaching everyone with all wisdom, so that we may present everyone perfect in Christ. To this end I labor, struggling with all his energy, which so powerfully works in me." And in that statement, Paul gives us really not only his life purpose, but he also gives us the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church, why we exist, is to present people mature in Christ. So that when we stand before Christ, we may present everyone in the congregation perfect in Christ. Now, as we look at the New Testament, it really involves two things. Christ gives us that in Matthew 22, 37 through 40, when he says that what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of the law? Or what are we to do? And he says, well, we're to love God and we're to love our neighbor. So that first it involves presenting people perfect in Christ, involves building a very intense relationship with Christ. so that we're building that within the lives of people. And it's not measured by our experience, but rather our obedience to Christ. If you love me, Christ says, what will you do? You will keep my commandments. So if we're to present people perfect in Christ, the church needs to be in the business of coming alongside of people and helping them to be in obedience to Christ and living in relationship with Christ, so they have that personal relationship. Secondly, it involves the development of an in-depth love for one another. So that the purpose of the church has both a vertical aspect and a horizontal aspect. That we're to love God, we're to love our neighbor because of our love for God. That's the outflow of that. But not just within the church, but also even outside the church. That God calls us not only to be loving within the confines of our congregation, but He calls us to demonstrate love to people outside the church walls. So as we think about strategic planning, we need to clarify that purpose so that that's always at the forefront of our thinking. So that everything we do is based upon how is it going to affect the maturity and the growth of the people that we're serving. Whether it's bringing them to a Christ and getting them started on the maturing process or helping them in that process. How are we going to do that? So strategic planning begins by clarifying our purpose. Secondly, it involves the clarifying of the ministries of the church. Lyle Schaller, in his book, Creative Church Administration, really outlines two types of ministries that are within the church. The first of all is what he calls basic ministries. These are the ongoing core ministries that are essential to the church. These are the ministries that the church conducts year in and year out and are foundational to the church and basic to the survival and ministry of the church. So in the small church, we would think of the Sunday morning worship service, Sunday school. These are essential ministries. These are basic ministries that regardless of what we're doing, we know that these will be there. That becomes the foundation for everything that we do. So these are the ministries that we're going to devote most of our time and resources to perform because they're core ministries. The second avenue of ministry is what Schaller calls the advanced ministries. And these are ministries that expand the ministry of the church. Now this may be new ministries that we start to meet new needs in the community. For example, if there's been a significant influx of Hispanics, we may decide to start a Spanish-speaking ministry. And so that would be a new ministry. Maybe a Spanish-speaking Bible study, or even a Spanish-speaking worship service. But that's a new ministry that is the church is starting because of new ministry opportunities. Or the advanced ministry may be a significant advancement in a current ministry. So that we look at a ministry that's already in existence within the church, but we want to focus and really advance that ministry. For example, it may be the ministry to teens. We've had a youth ministry in the past. Our church has always had a youth group. But as we look at the needs in the community and the opportunities, we see that we really need to expand this ministry. And so we're going to devote more time and energy and resources to the expansion of this present ministry. And that would be an advanced ministry. Or it may be an area of ministry that needs special intention in order to strengthen and build the church. Maybe it's a ministry that's struggling that we need to really shore up and build. And so these are the ministries that we will devote specific time and energy to address. And so again, as Lyle Schaller suggests, that most of our time and energy will be in the basic ministries. But every year we should always have at least one advanced ministry. There should be one area of ministry that this coming year we want to really focus upon and advance and build within the church ministry. And so as you think about your church, what are the core basic ministries that your church has. And then you need to ask yourselves, okay, what are the advanced ministries that we need to have? What is the one area that we want to focus upon for this year or the next couple of years or however long it takes that we want to focus upon that will really build our church? So as we think about strategic planning, we plan regarding the basic ministries, but then we also make plans regarding the advanced ministries. That's clarifying goals. So as we think about developing a strategic plan, first we want to clarify the purpose. Second, we want to clarify our ministries. What are the basic ministries? What are the advanced ministries? And then lastly, we want to clarify our goals. What are the goals that we need to accomplish? What is it that we specifically need to focus upon? So as we think about setting goals, there's several things we need to keep in mind. First of all, we need to avoid making just quantitative goals. Probably the biggest mistake we make in goal setting is that we usually focus upon quantitative goals. Our goal this year is to increase our attendance by 25%, or our goal this year is to increase the youth group by 25%, or to increase our giving. And so we put quantitative numbers on them, and then certainly there's value to that at times. But the reality is that's just only part of our overall ministry. And by doing that, sometimes we can set the church up for failure. We make it our quantitative goal to reach 20 people with the gospel of Christ. Well, when we don't accomplish that, then there's a sense of failure. And also, as we think about the ministry of the church, much of the ministry of the church goes beyond numbers. In fact, the majority of the ministry of the church is not number-oriented. How do you measure spiritual growth? How do you measure spiritual maturity? How can we measure the growth of fellowship within the church or the growth of people's theological understandings? We can't put a quantitative number on that, and yet we would all recognize that those are foundational and essential to the ministry of the church. That far more important than numbers is the spiritual growth and maturity of the church. We can have a church that is growing numerically, but very spiritually immature. And so we need to go beyond that. This is not to say that we cannot measure goals, make measurable goals in areas, but we need to recognize that we need to go beyond that. Secondly, goals should be consistent with the purpose and mission of the church. Again, we've already mentioned this, but we need to again highlight it. As we make our goals and we start thinking about goals, all goals should be in line with the overall purpose of the church, which is to spiritually transform people. If our goals are not ultimately contributing to that process, then they're not worthy of the focal point of the church. That's where we need to focus. Thirdly, goals should be consistent with the resources that we have. Certainly there are times we need to step out in faith. There are times to say, our budget last year did not allow for us to put anything within the budget for youth ministry, but this year we're going to increase our budget based upon the belief that God has called us to build a youth ministry, and by faith we're going to step out and trust God to provide. And certainly there is the need for stepping out in faith, but we also need to be realistic and recognizing that we do have limited resources, and so they need to be consistent with that. Goals, fourthly, should be clear and understood. They should better enable people to understand how they are to focus their energies. There should be clarity to what we're doing and how we're going to go about doing it. Fifthly, goals should unify the church. It should strengthen the church, not divide the church. And then lastly, goals, we should set few goals but make them critical goals. We're far better off to set 1 or 2 goals for the coming year and focus upon them than we are to make 10 goals and become so multiplicity in our goals that we don't accomplish anything. So we need to focus upon the goals. So as we think about developing a strategic plan, it involves clarifying the purpose, it involves clarifying the ministries, it involves clarifying the goals. And then we need to clarify our objectives. The objectives are the specific action plans that we take to implement their goals. Goals define the direction that we're to go. The objectives gives us the steps to accomplish those goals. So that when we talk about goals, we're talking about what may be done over 1 or 2 years. When we're talking about objectives, we're talking about what specifically needs to be done in the present to lead us to the goals. So as we think about goals, every goal should have at least several objectives that it seeks to accomplish. For example, if the goal is to reach the unchurched parents of the children involved in our children program, several of the objectives might be to have parties or to have parents' nights to acquaint them with the ministry. So our goal is to reach the parents. Our objective then is to have a couple parent night where we invite them in. We have more of kind of a party atmosphere, and we share with them the ministry that we're doing with their children. A second objective might be to develop a visitation program, that we go out and we visit those parents of the unchurched children that come to our church program. And then lastly, our objective may be to send home literature for parents to read. See, we're getting specifics in terms of how we can reach the goal of reaching the parents. And then we need to evaluate the outcome. Once we've set our goals, once we've set our objectives and we've implemented them, then we need to evaluate what did they achieve. Did they enable us to accomplish what we set out to accomplish? If so, great. How can we be more effective? If not, what do we need to do differently? So it enables us to make the changes